Good evening. Well, we left off last Wednesday. We had gotten to 1 Kings chapter 7 and verse 39, and I was so bold, as Chris said, to try and say I would get through the whole chapter of chapter 7 last week, and needless to say, I did not make it. But we got very close, and actually I think closer than what you might believe, because the following text, when we pick up there in 1 Kings chapter 7 and verse 40, is really kind of going to give a recount of the things that we've already read through chapter 7. So it's kind of a refresher of everything that we looked at in the previous things that were made by Hiram. But we'll pick up there in verse 40 of 1 Kings chapter 7. If somebody will, read verse 40 through verse 46.
Finished doing all the work that he was to do for King Solomon, for the house of the Lord. The two pillars, the two bowl-shaped capitals that were on top of the two pillars, the two networks covering the two bowl-shaped capitals, which were on top of the pillars, 400 pomegranates for the two networks, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network to cover the two bowl-shaped capitals that were on top of the pillars, the 10 carts, the 10 levers, and the carts, 1 seat and 12 oxen under the seat, the pots, the shovels, and the bowls. All these articles which Hiram made for King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of burnished bronze.
One more verse.
In the plain of Jordan, the king had them cast in clay molds between Succoth and Zartan.
Thank you, sir. All right, just looking at that text, it's pretty easy to see what's being stated is, okay, here is Hiram. He has finished his work for King Solomon, and this is a recount of all the things that he actually made for the temple at Solomon's request. And it kind of goes through in the same order as which we saw them introduced in the previous part of the chapter, and it just lists all these things out again. Really, the only thing that really stands out in that section is verse 46, where it talks about in the plains of the Jordan, the king had them cast in clay molds between Succoth and Zartan. Now, this location is off the Jordan, of course, in the plain of the Jordan, and to the best of my ability with our Bible software and Atlas, it looks like it's maybe around 20 miles, which was kind of surprising, the distance between Jerusalem and actually where this location that's given is. So what most think is that the area, as far as these molds being made of clay, there was something about this area that the clay there was very good for the work that this man was doing, and this was the place that he chose to do it. And it gives us a little bit of insight as far as how he was going about making these different things of bronze by using these clay molds to actually make these things in. So not a lot of difference there as far as what we've seen in the previous text, just kind of a repeat of the things that were done. So we're going to go ahead and move forward and catch this last section here in chapter 7, and then we'll jump into chapter 8. If somebody will they read verse 47 through 51?
And Solomon did not weigh all the articles, because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Thus Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of the Lord, the altar of gold and the table of gold on which was the showbread, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary, with the flowers and the lamps and the wick trimmers of gold, the basins, the trimmers, the bowls, the ladles, and the censers of pure gold, and the hinges of gold, both for the doors of the inner room, the most holy place, and for the doors of the main hall of the temple. So all the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought in the things which his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings. He put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord.
Thank you, sir. So all of this stuff that Hiram had made, all this that he had made of bronze, it says that there was no weight given to all of these things, and the idea goes with that there was so much that was used. They didn't even bother trying to keep up with the quantity of weight of material that was used to produce all of these things at Solomon's request that would be used there at the temple, all of the furnishings. There was just so much stuff. And of course they had, as we've been stating as we move through the text, they had everything in great abundance. And even David, as mentioned there at the latter part, was also storing up things for all of these things that would take place with the temple. So he continues, he finishes his work as it pertains to all the bronze, and it was so much it couldn't be determined. And then it shifts gears there at verse 48, and it focuses more on the inwards of the temple. And again, everything that we saw before as it pertained to the temple was covered in gold, right? So everything that goes into the temple is still going to remain as pure gold. And he continues to make these things as it works as a table for the showbread, the lampstands, all of these things that would go within the temple are made of pure gold, just as we've seen in the previous chapters as everything as it pertains to the inward works of the temple. But he finishes up all of his work. He finishes up the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord. He was finished. Verse 51. And Solomon brought the things which his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings, and he put them in the treasury of the house of the Lord. Now, David had put all this stuff back. He wanted a lot of stuff to be prepared so that it could be used for the building of the temple, right? And all the riches that would go into this build, but there was still a great abundance actually left over. So they go along and they take all of that, and now they're going to store it in the treasury. Which, if you think ahead, even like Daniel with... was it Daniel chapter 5? Daniel chapter 5, where the king is sitting there with the golden vessels that came from the temple, right? And he's drinking his wine from those golden vessels. The gold that they would actually take from the temple when the temple was destroyed, when God's people were actually overthrown and they were taken into captivity. So there was a lot of gold and things of that nature that was there, and things that David had stored up, right? And all that was still left over, they then put in there, and they put in the treasury. So there's this great collection of gold and silver and everything left over from the build of the temple. Now, this is the second time we catch a statement of the temple being finished. And I'll kind of explain why I bring that up here in a minute when we get into chapter 8. But there's this one recognition to the temple being finished in the previous chapter, which was at the end of chapter 6. And it's actually stating that in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its details according to all its plans. So he was 7 years into the building of it. Now, I'm going to ask for some thoughts on some of this time frame once we get into chapter 8, because it's a little bit challenging to determine, okay, is there kind of a little bit of going forwards in time and telling about more building, and then a backtrack in time that takes place between chapter 7 and chapter 8? Or does it continue in a chronological format, and it's just picking on up? And you'll see what I mean when we get there. But let's go ahead and let's move into chapter 8. And I have this section. Today, me and Preston talked about this, and I actually changed my outline today, which may not be a really good thing at all when it gets ready to teach a class, you know. But my focus changed as it pertains to what I was looking at in chapter 8. You see, when we come into a text, especially like chapter 6 and like chapter 7, where there's so much detail, all the detail as it pertained to the temple, as it pertained to Solomon's palace, all the gold and all the bronze and all of these little things as it pertained to the temple, it's real easy to continue and look at the fine detail, where really when you come into chapter 8, you need to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture and see what's really taking place here. Yes, we've looked at all these things that Solomon has ordered to be done and what he's accomplished, but now we're fixing to see a bigger picture, and that's kind of where I changed my outline today. I was more focused on what Solomon was doing through chapter 8. And then I looked at it a little bit more, and I said, man, I really need to be focused on what God's doing, right? Because that's what I've been doing in chapter 6 and chapter 7. I've looked at everything that Solomon has done, and it's real easy to kind of stay in that flow of thought. I think there's a lot more that we can learn from chapter 8 when we step back and we look at it from God's perspective and see what he's actually accomplished with his people and continues to accomplish with them. And we'll see that as we work through chapter 8, the further we get into it. But let's start the first section, God's presence with his people, chapter 8, starting there in verse 1, working through verse 11. If someone will read verse 1 through verse 7, please.
Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is Zion. Therefore all the men of Israel assembled with King Solomon at the feast in the month 7th month. So all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. Then they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tabernacle of meeting, and all the holy furnishings that were in the tabernacle. The priest and the Levites brought them up. Also King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel, who were assembled with him, were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be counted or numbered for multitude. Then the priests brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place, into the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their two wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles.
Thank you, sir. Okay, the major focus coming into chapter 8 is now the temple is established. We've got all the furnishings and all the things that we need to do all the work that needs to be done in the temple. Now we lack bringing the Ark of the Covenant and placing it there between the wings of the cherubim in the most holy of holies, right? Here's what's fixing to take place. And if you look at this section, and we'll really see more about God once we get to the latter part of this text and then moving into the next section, but you start seeing everything that kind of went wrong in the past, you see them doing right in this moment. You think about the previous time that they moved the ark, what was some of the trouble that they run into? Somebody died, right? And then what'd you say? They didn't move it on the poles, right? So they moved it wrong. They had somebody, because of that, something took place. It actually took a man's life because he reached out and he touched the ark. The difference in what you see with Solomon here at the very beginning, it's saying there in verse 1 that Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is Zion. Now, they're not having to move this ark a very long distance at all. You know, it's there within the city of David. It's there within Jerusalem. They're not moving it a long distance, but Solomon isn't going to cut any corners in what it is that they are supposed to do as it pertains to moving this ark. You could say probably he heard about the things that took place. They learned from their mistakes, and they're going to do things right this time. So you see the proper people moving this ark, and ultimately you see that as you see the mention of the elders in verse 3 of Israel, the priests, verse 3, and then even in verse 4 where there's a mention of the Levites. All the way back to Numbers chapter 3, even in verse 31, there's the responsibility that the Levites had as it pertained to the Ark of the Covenant and all of the furnishings that were within the temple, or within the tabernacle at that time. Here's their responsibility. They are to move these things. So he's having them move them as they're supposed to. Even for this short distance, he has the right people moving it. And they're also doing it by the proper means, the proper transportation, right? They're using the poles, and you see that mentioned, that the poles that they used, they left them in there. Well, it was told even back before that these poles were to stay in the rings that were attached to the ark, that they were not to be removed from it, because this was the means of which they were to move it. And they were doing just as they were supposed to. They also offer up all these sacrifices. More sacrifices than what could be numbered. If you remember when David moved the Ark of the Covenant, when he actually did move it into the city of David, you remember there was a great celebration that took place. There was dancing and there was music and there was all these things, and David just jumping around, it seemed, just really carrying on about what they had done, and they also offered up sacrifices. Well, the same thing. They're offering up all kinds of sacrifices, so much so that it can't even be numbered, the quantity of sacrifices that are being offered at this moment. Now, all that is good and all that is right, but here's the thing that is really important. If you go back to verse 2, and you look there at the 7th month, what is the importance of the 7th month mentioned there in verse 2? What's that? No, it goes back to some of their responsibilities as far as their days that they would come together, the feast days. If you turn back, look back to Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23. The feast days that the people had to come together, right? All of the people had to come together, and there was these specific days that were set appointed by God that they would come together. And especially seen there in the feast, let's see. Children of Israel, on the 7th month there, verse 24. Verse 24, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of the blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. And this is the start of that coming together, and then you see the Day of Atonement. If you keep turning there in the next page, likely in your Bible, it might say the Feast of the Tabernacle also. Now, what was the tabernacle, this Feast of the Tabernacle, to represent to God's people? It's within the name of it.
Well, the booth.
Right. Right. And it's bringing to their mind a remembrance of what it was that they used to have to do, right? And how they moved through the wilderness, and even in God bringing them together with a tabernacle to have that opportunity to worship Him. All these things that they would do over the years, now it's all coming together. It says back in our text, in the 7th month. Now, I would assume there might be some significance to the timing as far as when they're bringing the ark into its location, its resting place. This is a month where all the people are coming together. They're coming together for these feast days. Now, here's the question. When you go back to where we saw that the temple was completed, there at the end of chapter 6, it says it was completed in the 8th month. Now it's saying we're coming together in the 7th month as the ark is being moved into the temple. So are we looking at what was this kind of skip in time ahead? Okay, Solomon had finished the temple, and then it's in this discussion about the building that Solomon did, and it goes on and says, okay, well, Solomon also, chapter 7, built all these things for his palace, and then goes back to the bronze work that was done by Hiram, and then back to moving the ark. Was this something that took place a month prior, or is this something that actually took place 11 months later? Any thoughts? It's kind of difficult. I don't know that I have an answer for certain if I could say one way or the other. I guess I could see it in both directions, just for the simple fact that the text doesn't always follow in perfect chronological format. Sometimes it does jump forwards and it jumps back, right? But at the same time, I could see it being the case that, okay, they had finished the temple, and the month was stated, the 8th month, and then you bring in this guy Hiram, and you still have all this work that needs to be done as it pertains to the things of bronze for the molten sea, for the carts and all of these things. And maybe it took him these 11 months to actually complete all of that stuff, and he was then done with it in time for the feast days when they would come together. It's possible. I don't know if I have an answer to say it's one way or the other. Either way, the time that all this was done and the time that they had it completely done with everything they needed to do the work they needed to do in the temple, it was the time of the year which all the people would come together and they would worship God and they would offer up sacrifices. So the timing, I think, was very unique in this. Whether or not this was a whole 11 months after the finishing of the temple, I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that specifically. The more I look through the text, I almost feel like it might carry in chronological order, saying they finished it, and then when he brought in Hiram, while Hiram's doing all of that work, Solomon's also building his palace, and then once he's done with all of that, it's falling out almost in time for the feast to start. So they move right on into that kind of thing. That's a possibility. Thoughts?
Just another aside, but here they observed the Feast of the Tabernacles, but we know when you get to Ezra and Nehemiah, and they restored it, and it had been long forgotten. They go, I wonder how many years it was before they began to fade away from observing that.
Right.
Because it says, there was apparently a long period. Mm-hmm. That was a pretty good time from Solomon to Ezra and Nehemiah, but it would have had to have not been too many years
right
down the road.
it doesn't take long once you get past the reign of Solomon before you start seeing these kind of mentions of things that were forgotten, things that they forgot to do that they were supposed to do. Even the book of law being found there by Josiah and his group that were kind of refurbishing the temple. All of a sudden they're like, wow, here's this book of the law, right? Where's this been? So, I mean, they do kind of start losing sight of things quickly. And even to your point, you know, there was a time where they had forgotten that they were supposed to do this. You know, these particular feasts, they weren't actually, you know, upholding all of their responsibility. But, you know, here it seems like maybe, you know, being with the significance that came with these feast days and the Day of Atonement and all of those things, it seems like that might have been part of the planning. I don't know. That's just my thoughts as far as it goes. But let's go ahead and let's look there from verse 8 to verse 11, if someone will.
The poles extended so that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside, and they are there to this day. Nothing was in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. And it came to pass, when the priests came out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord.
Thanks, sir. The poles extended so that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place in the front of the inner sanctuary. All right, the poles are in the specific location, right? They weren't supposed to be removed from the rings of the Ark of the Covenant. That's where they were supposed to stay. Now, I don't know necessarily what it means by this, they can be seen. If you remember, even when discussing the build of the temple, there were doors there at the opening of the temple coming into the holy place, and then there were doors again to the Holy of Holies. Well, if you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 3, 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 14, it says, "And he made a veil of blue, purple, crimson, and fine linen, and wove cherubim into it." This is something they're separating even the entryway into the most holy. Well, there's some sort of veil there, this fabric veil, but there's also the doors. And I don't know if it's just saying that the ends of these rods would have been able to see, like leaving an impression on the veil once it was pulled to, or if the veil was open, they could be seen. I'm not exactly sure what that's saying. But whatever the case be, in some fashion, the poles are extending out, and you can see them from the holy place looking toward the Holy of Holies, but you can't see them from outside the temple. I don't know, just some added detail that's thrown in there within the text. Well, the ark itself is moved in, and there's nothing actually within the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses had put in there at Horeb. Now, there were other things at times that were placed within the tabernacle that were there close to the Ark of the Covenant. You remember what those were? Aaron's rod. Wasn't there one more? That's right, the jar of manna. So those 2 things. But the only things that were actually in the ark that actually remained in it were these 2 tablets that Moses had brought, that he came down from Mount Sinai with the commandments. And these are actually there still in the ark as it is being placed into the temple under the wings of the cherubim where it now rests. And it says there in verse 10, "And it came to pass when the priest came out of the holy place that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord." If you remember all the way back to the end of the book of Exodus, like the last section of text in the book of Exodus, there was this moment with the tabernacle where the glory of the Lord, this cloud of smoke, filled the tabernacle, and it also came up over the tabernacle. And as long as that cloud was there over the tabernacle, the people remained there in that place. But if the cloud moved, the people also picked up and they moved, right? They would travel with that. God was with them as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. And that was the signifying of God being with his people and them following him. Well, the glory of the Lord is shown here in the temple, and the only thing that you can really, I suppose, take from that, God is pleased. He is satisfied with what they have done, right? This was his plan all along. He wants this fellowship. He wants this connection. He wanted this temple built And he wants this ark placed there, and this is going to be something special to God and his people in the relationship that they share with one another. Now, here's where the focus is really going to turn on what God is actually doing for his people in the relationship that he wants to have with them. Now, as we move forward in this text, you're going to start seeing a lot of similarities, not in this next section, but the following. A lot of similarities and a lot of symbolism that you could connect to Christianity today. And I think it's somewhat fascinating when you can make all the connections and see the connections from the things that pertain to them in the temple and their relationship with God. And you look all the way until now in the things that are through Christ that we have that fellowship and that connection to our God. But let's go ahead and let's move forward unless there's any questions or thoughts. All right. Now, I battled within my mind what I wanted to title this section, all right? Because I want to turn our attention to God, and I want us to really think about what he's doing within all of this rather than thinking about, okay, this is what Aaron's doing. So I want us to consider how we can see God's love in this next section, which is going to run from verse 12 through verse 21. Verse 12, it says, "Then Solomon spoke. The Lord said he would dwell in the dark cloud. I have surely built you an exalted house and a place for you to dwell in forever." Now, we've already talked about the cloud and, how this representation of God and him being there with his people. And then Solomon also states there in verse 13 about building an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. He says that in one sense, but he's going to make sure that we understand that there's no house, there's no building, there's no structure that can contain God. He wants to make sure that everybody's aware of this, and he says this in front of the people. Look, there's nothing that I built here that actually contains God. Yes, this is a place, this is a location where God is with his people. This house has the name of the Lord on it. This is his dwelling place with his people, but it does not contain him. He is so much greater than this, and he's going to express that point as we move forward. All right, I'm going to go ahead and read verse 14 through verse 21, and then I want us to come back and look at how we can see God's love toward his people in that section. Verse 14, "Then the king turned around and blessed the whole assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel was standing. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who spoke with his mouth to my father David, and with his hand has fulfilled it, saying, Since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have chosen no city from any tribe of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. Now it was in the heart of my father David to build a temple for the name of the Lord God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, Whereas it was in your heart to build a temple for my name, you did well, in that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build a temple, but your son, who will come from your body, he shall build the temple for my name. So the Lord has fulfilled his word which he spoke, and I have filled the position of my father David, and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised. And I have built a temple for the name of the Lord God of Israel, and there I have made a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord which he made with our fathers when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. Okay, there's a lot of things that are stated within this little section here. Things that we have seen that have been repeated again and again and again, even just within the reign of Solomon. Things that David reminded him, things that God has reminded him about. All of these little details. Now, where can we see God's love on display as it pertains to his people through the words that are written in this text? In what ways can we see his love extended to his people? Speaks to his people, right? He has communication with his people. That communication with his people is pointing to the fact that he desires his people. He wants to have that relationship with them. What else? What's that? He chose David to be the leader over his people, right? So even pointing to David, but also even to the nation, this is something that God had chose, right? dwelling place, right? He wanted this dwelling place. He wanted that connection to his people. Promises. That's a good one. Think about the promises of God. Where did all this start? Everything that's taking place, where did this originate? This was in the mind of God. This was God's plan being fulfilled through his people. This was God's plan in David. This was God's plan in Solomon. This is God's promises coming to fulfillment in what he wants and the relationship that he desires with his people. Anything else? Yes, sir.
The temple was a place for his presence, and they could come before his presence. They couldn't come, only the high priest could come into the actual holy place, but the people could come into the temple and worship and commune with him.
Right. It gave that fellowship and commune with God as far as him, the presence of God being there with his people. What about God's deliverance? He went all the way back to Egypt with this. Think about when they were in bondage. They didn't do anything for God to owe them anything, right? This was God's love on full display from the very beginning, that he brought these people out of Egypt and he had a plan for them. And now we're reaching this point in time where these things are being fulfilled, and even the promises that were made to David are being fulfilled, and Solomon building this temple and the ark being established there and the promises of God, all this coming together. All of that was in the mind of God. All of that is from the love of God being displayed to his people. Now, I want you to think as we move into this next section as it pertains even to the love that's been extended to us. And think about the temple that we look at in this text, but also think about the temple that's seen as we consider New Testament Christianity. What is the temple? Right? We're these, 1 Peter chapter 4, chapter 2. We are these spiritual stones being fitted together at chapter 2. I got my 1 Peter teacher up here. He knows the text well. 1 Peter chapter 2, right? We're the stones being fitted together to build this spiritual temple. Think about those things when we go through this text and consider the similarities that you can see as it pertains to what this temple is used for and the fellowship that God's people had with him through this temple. And think about that and even moving forwards into New Testament Christianity and our relationship we have with God through Jesus Christ. All right, let's go ahead and let's move forward to verse 22. God's forgiveness is something that you're fixing to see again and again and again as we work through this text. Prayer is something that you're going to see again and again and again as we move through this text. You're going to see this mention of prayer and this connection to God and this ability to receive forgiveness, and all of it pointing toward them turning back to God. Anytime they fall away from him, they turn back and they pray toward this temple. They pray toward God. This is somewhat, in a sense, this mediator point between them and God. A lot of similarities we can make even to Jesus the Christ. But let's go ahead and you'll see what I mean as we go through the text. But someone read verse 22 through verse 24.
And Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands toward heaven. And he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven above or on earth below like you, who will keep your covenant and mercy with your servants, who walk before you with all their heart. You have kept what you promised your servant David, my father. You have both spoken with your mouth and fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day.
Thank you, sir. Solomon standing before the people, before the altar, and all of the assembly of Israel. The chronicler actually describes in a sense that they had built this bronze platform as well, like 7 foot or 7 cubits. I can't remember exactly, but there's this platform built, and Solomon's actually on this platform. And what we'll see even later in this text, when he stops in this prayer, he rises himself up. What the chronicler, the writer of the Chronicles, writes is that he is down on this platform that they have made. His arms are spread, and he's bowed down before the people, bowed down before the Lord, and he's given this prayer or this speech before the people. Well, he's standing or kneeling before all of Israel, and he says in verse 23, the Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven above or on earth below like you, who keep your covenant and mercy with your servant who walk before you with all their hearts. There's no other like you. There is no God anywhere else that is anything like you. You are the one and true God. He's turning his full attention now to God, and he's turning the people their full attention to God also, and says there's nobody else like you. You are completely unique. You are completely separate. You are the one true God of heaven. And he says it is your covenant that you keep, your mercy that you continue to extend. And what's the stipulation found there in the end of verse 23? Those who walk before you with all their hearts. There's a stipulation and a responsibility for those who are going to be pleasing in the sight of God, even then, still today. That we are going to walk before him, that we're going to strive to serve him. We're going to strive to the best of our ability with all of our heart to serve him, to love him, to keep him first and foremost in our lives. Solomon's turning the attention of the people. Now that the ark is here, now that they are gathered together, he is turning their attention, saying there is no other God like him. He is the Almighty God. He says, you keep your promises, verse 24. The promise you made to David, the promise has been fulfilled through me. But look what he says, at your hand, the end of verse 24, as it is this day. Again, pointing back to the plan of God, this is God's hand that's been at work, his providential hand that's been working through all of the time, bringing about all of this, bringing about this connection, this fellowship that they'll have with God. Now, here's where we start to see it a little bit further, and we're going to start seeing what this actually brings about for them. Somebody read verse 25 through 27, please.
Therefore, Lord God of Israel, now keep what you promised your servant David, my father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man sit before me on the throne of Israel, only if your sons take heed to their way, that they walk before me as you have walked before me. And now I pray, O God of Israel, let your word come true, which you have spoken to your servant David, my father. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built?
Thank you, sir. Again, he keeps pointing back to these promises, but ultimately now this is all established. You've done your part, God. You've continued to uphold your promise. You've continued to do what you say. Now, even as stated, remember when David told Solomon, look, as long as you continue to take heed and to follow in the ways of the Lord, that there will always be a man to serve on the throne, right? This kingdom would be established, and if they never did turn away, God would have kept his promise. He would have continued to fulfill his promise in that matter, but ultimately, it was the people who turned away from him, right? They're the ones who are at fault in the matter. He turns and he says, verse 26, and now I pray, O God of Israel, let your word come true, which you have spoken to your servant David, my father. Verse 27, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built? That's a reminder. Look, yes, we built this temple. This is what you wanted. This is your plan. And he's almost given this idea to the people. Don't ever think for a second that this is actually containing our God. The heavens cannot contain our God. There is nothing that can contain our God. Don't look to this physical temple and take comfort in it in the sense that there is safety in this temple, the physical building. Now, what do we start seeing a problem with later on as we work through the book of Kings? As we work through the history, even in Jeremiah? The physical. They turn and they think that this temple, that this location, that this physical building was actually this safety net, that nothing could happen to them. He's telling them, look, don't get so fixated on this. There's nothing on this world that can actually hold our God. He's so much greater than that. And then he's going to shift gears in verse 28. And he says, yet regard the prayers of your servant and his supplication, O Lord my God, and listen to the cry and the prayer which your servant is praying before you today. Okay, yes, God, you are so vast that there's nothing that can contain you. But yet you have provided this plan, and here is this representation of you dwelling with us, this house that has your name. Now we have this connection to you, and we can offer up prayers to you. And please hear our prayers. Hear us, right? Okay, verse 29, that your eyes may be open toward this temple night and day, toward the place of which you said, my name shall be there, that you may hear the prayer which your servant makes toward this place, and that you may hear the supplication of your servant of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Here in heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. Your dwelling place is in heaven. This box does not contain you, but please, God, hear our prayers, hear our supplications. This is a point to where they can actually come before God. They can offer up their prayers, and what we're going to see next week when we work through this section of text, the rest almost of this chapter, it's all of these scenarios where Solomon is saying, look, if your people do this and they turn away from you, when they turn back to you and they cry out to you, please hear them. All for forgiveness. There's this connection, this fellowship that they are fixing, that they have been experiencing, yet now it's in a different kind of way, I guess, in a sense, that they have this physical location. But it's all about this fellowship that they have with God and His ability to hear them and continue to remain in fellowship with them. I don't think we're going to be able to get much further than that, but just a few things to think about now that we're talking about this temple and the purpose and this prayer, the prayers that can be offered up and the forgiveness that can be received. You think about even in Jesus' ministry. You think about some of the things that were stated. Think about what He said that this temple was to be for, even in Matthew chapter 21. He said this was to be a house of prayer. But what had they done to it? A den of thieves, right? A den of thieves. I'll get into some other verses from the New Testament. We'll start making a lot of application in our next class of how this can tie to us very much so as well. Thank you for your attention. That covers 1 Kings chapter 8 through verse 30.